Welcome to everybody. Welcome to this talk, which is the last of the lectures to be delivered as part of a theme year titled State, Space, and Citizenship, Indian Cities in the Global Era that's been taking place over the past calendar year. I want to take this last opportunity to thank, first of all, Ranveer and Adarsh Trehan for their support of this theme year and all the events that have been a part of it. I'd also like to thank Sriyoshi Day and David Merchant of the Center for South Asian Studies for all of the hard work that they've put into this over the course of the year. And finally, thanks once again to my co-conspirator and co-coordinator of the theme year, Neha Sami, a doctoral student in urban planning. It's been wonderful working with her. And finally, thanks to all of you, or many of you are faces that I've seen at many of the theme year events, and all of you are the ones who have really made this a success. Leela Fernandes is professor of political science at Rutgers University for the time being. She has a PhD in political science and an MA in international relations from the University of Chicago and bachelor's degrees in computer engineering and English literature from right here in Ann Arbor, University of Michigan. Her research interests span comparative politics, gender, political economy, labor studies, and post-colonial studies. The area that she's perhaps been the most influential in is in the study, or at least perhaps this is what I'm most familiar with in her work, is the study of India's middle class. Her work has shed a great deal of light on the influence of the middle class in India's politics and on the role of politics in the construction of this class. Her research has been funded by the MacArthur Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, Social Science Research Council, American Institute for Indian Studies, and the Rockefeller Foundation, a number of prestigious sources. Her books include Producing Workers, The Politics of Gender, Class, and Culture in the Calcutta Jute Mills, Transforming Feminist Practice, Nonviolence, Social Justice, and the Possibilities of Spiritualized Feminism, and India's New Middle Class, Democratic Politics in an Era of Economic Reform. She's currently working on a book titled Transnational Feminism, Essays in Ethics, Politics, and Knowledge, as well as a project on a book manuscript on the politics of religious conversion. These books are in addition to a number of journal articles and book chapters. She is a very productive scholar. What I'm most delighted to tell you about Leela, although I think many of you already know, is that we'll be seeing a lot more of her in the coming years as she's going to be joining the UM faculty as a professor of women's studies and political science in the fall of 2010. I understand that there are also negotiations to see if she'll be interested in coaching the football team. I'm personally extremely excited that she's going to be joining us, and I've actually considered stealing her boarding pass so she can't get on the plane to go back to New Jersey because I can't wait to begin working with her. Leela's talk today is titled The State After Liberalization, Reflections on Inequality and the Middle Classes in India. Please join me in welcoming her back to Ann Arbor. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and Gavin, for the invitation, and to both you and Neha for all of your support in organizing this. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, so what I want to do in my talk today is I'm basically sort of working on I'm calling them a set of reflections because I'm trying to think through some issues regarding the Indian state based on the work which I did on the new middle class. So a lot of the sort of empirical parts of my presentation today are going to draw from the research which I did for the Indian Middle Class book, which I published a couple of years ago. But one of the things that happened is that through the writing of the book, sort of reflecting on the information and the sort of analysis I did through the book, was that I feel the need to grapple more with what is happening to the Indian state in the context of economic liberalization, because there's a tendency to assume that the state is simply sort of retreating. That's one set of assumptions which you sometimes assume, which goes along with issues of privatization, or is simply being captured by private capital. And my sense is that there's much more to that. So I don't think so I'll say in advance, I'm not necessarily going to give you a concrete set of findings, and I'm actually hoping that I'll get a lot out of your responses, because I'm trying to sort of rework this for another research project on the middle classes and social policy. So some of the talk is going to be a little bit theoretical. Some of it is going to be thinking through broader issues based on my middle class project, and I'm going to try and put it together, hopefully at least halfway coherently, but we'll see. So the way in which this is located, my discipline of origin is political science. And some recent research in political science has pointed to the need to examine the emergence of new state activities in the context of economic liberalization. So if anyone's a political scientist here, for example, you may know of Jonah Levy's work, for example. He has argued that such state activities have shifted from a market steering to a market supporting orientation. And he draws mainly on research on sort of Western or advanced industrialized countries. And he argues that one of the biggest sources of new state activities lies with the agenda of economic liberalization. And his work is really based on France, Japan, and Germany. So, for example, he looks at how in France the state played a very active role in dismantling the French welfare state and sort of pushing liberalization. So he focuses mainly on advanced industrialized countries. However, recent research in the Indian context has also begun to point to the significance of the role of the state in shaping economic reforms in India. So, for example, recent research has shown that local state governments have played a very central role in driving liberalization. And I'm thinking here of work by Seema Sinha and Lloyd and Suzanne Rudolph. And so in reading some of this research, I've been, and drawing on my work on the middle classes, I've been thinking that the specificities of the post-colonial late industrialization sort of phase of, or sort of context of the Indian economy calls for a closer and more systematic examination of the nature and extent of these new state activities. So what are these new state activities? Are they really new? And how do they sort of play out in relationship to class politics is where I kind of want to eventually go with this specific paper I'm working on. And so right now in this talk, I'm just going to give you a sort of a sketch of what I'm thinking about right now. So it's a little bit informal in that sense. So an initial examination of the changing role of the Indian state, which I've been trying to go through, I think points to three central trends right now. So first of all, the policies of economic reform have produced new state activities as the state has sought to direct economic liberalization and manage the social and political conflicts that have been sparked by economic change. So there are sort of new changes, which I would suggest are sort of happening with liberalization. Second, while comparative research has illustrated that liberalization leads to a shift of the state's activities from an interventionist to a regulatory role, as Levy and the Rudolphs argue, the Indian state has also demonstrated a strong pattern of regulatory failure. So there's a distinctive sort of sense of the Indian state not really performing the regulatory role, which political scientists are arguing happens in advanced industrialized countries. So an analysis of liberalization needs to guard against the conflation between processes of privatization and state regulatory failure. So in other words, the failure of the state to provide services and to develop effective regulatory frameworks of governments have often provided a space that's been occupied by private actors and has produced privatized practices, but that's not necessarily the privatization which people who write about liberalization assume. It's more that the state is sort of failing and private actors are sort of moving in and taking up that space. And for those of you who work on NGOs, the NGOs would be one example of that. Stuart Corbett, for example, and his co-authors have talked a little bit about this and have called this the scarcity of the state in India. So this has examples of this would be, for example, ranging from middle-class citizens needing to turn to private suppliers of water and electricity when the state has failed to provide adequate infrastructure would be one specific example of that. Another example would be the privatization of land and space when the state has not produced effective regulatory structures for urban development. And some of you in the audience are much more up on the urban restructuring issues than I am. And then finally, a third pattern of state activities in the post-liberalization period has simply been the continuation of the older regimes of state-led development. So not everything is new. A lot of the older state patterns of sort of trying to produce development, particularly for rural and urban poor communities, still continue. So the liberalizing state coexists with the developmental state in ways that I suggest require closer investigation of the interaction between these different sets of state activities. Now, so that's one first part of what I'm trying to think through, is that there are these different kinds of state activities which I'm trying to sort of unpack. And then secondly, this layered and the shifting nature of state activities in the post-liberalization period is also shaped by what Atul Kohli has termed the multi-class nature of the Indian state. So given this multi-class nature of the state, historically the political economy of the Indian state has been shaped by complicated sets of class-state relations that have rested on shifting class coalitions. So the second thing which I'm trying to think through is how the different patterns of state activities, which I spelled out, are basically shaped by different class coalitions. So how do these class coalitions shape the ways in which the state is acting in the liberalization period? And in this part, I'm using some of my earlier research on the middle class to sort of think through that sort of issue of class coalitions. So, for example, a scholarship on the political economy of the early decades of the Indian state have emphasized several successive patterns of class coalitions that have shaped state practices. One prominent example would be Vivek Chibber's work, where he has emphasized relations between the state and the capitalist class, arguing that while the state and capitalists were in agreement regarding the need for state intervention, he argues that the capitalist class was able to effectively block the emergence of an effective developmental state. So in Chibber's analysis, the Indian state essentially favored protections for business rather than an export-led developmental strategy that would have compelled Indian business to face global competition. Now, while Chibber's work suggests that this class-state relationship unfolded, he argues that this class-state relationship, in a sense, determined the future of India's development strategies. Other scholars have argued that there are more complicated and varying sets of class coalitions that have shaped how the state is sort of shaping economic development in the post-colonial period. So, for example, I would suggest that these coalitions have centered around roughly 3 periods. In the 50s and 60s, for example, a coalition of urban and rural elites coalesced behind a mainly sort of urban-oriented industrial strategy. The middle classes were invested in the control of state resources and authority as state managers, while landed interests were protected by the state against the threat of land redistribution. In the 1970s and 1980s, newly emerging agrarian classes that have been called, for example, bullock capitalists by Lloyd and Suzanne Rudolph, or they've also been called the vernacular middle classes by Zoya Hassan, they increasingly began to mobilize and press for benefits and resources from the state. So by the early 1990s, it became commonplace, as most of you know, to speak of the political rise of previously marginalized groups like the other backward castes. So, so the questions that I'm trying to think through this presentation are, first of all, how are these different class coalitions shifting in the post-reform period since the 1990s, and how is the state attempting to manage these shifting coalitions? So, what is the state trying to do in relationship to conflicts over resources when different groups are competing and making competing demands on the state for resources? So the strains of managing the state's multi-class nature in the post-liberalization period since the 1990s are such that state activities have included practices from all of the patterns that I've laid out. So they range from examples of the state simply failing and sort of retreating so that the private sector intervenes and sort of takes over, either through private capital or through NGOs providing services. There are also new state activities that are shaped by merging coalitions and new class actors like the new middle class. So the new state activities sort of focusing more on delivering to middle class interests in urban areas would be one set of examples. And finally, you still have a sort of traditional development state activities which are designed to sort of incorporate marginalized groups by simply providing benefits and services. So the reservations would be one example of that, and trying to sort of develop rural employment schemes would be another example of the state using the older model of development to sort of keep those sort of fractions of the country within its sort of economic project. So the state has kind of, I suggest, oscillated between these patterns, and as it's tried to manage the competing demands on its resources. So in my talk, what I'd like to do is examine some of these issues and sketch out, I think, four basic sets of issues or sort of things that I'd like us to think about or talk about. I'm going to begin in the presentation by talking a little bit about some of how the state is using particular ideological practices to manage these strains, as it has all of these competing groups trying to sort of fit into the liberalizing economy. I then want to talk a little bit about the centrality of middle-class state relations in the post-liberalization period, in the sense of the new role which the middle class is sort of playing very actively and assertively, as it's claiming to sort of be the representative of these new economic policies. So, for example, my point there is that the new middle class has become a significant actor as it's tried to create and become part of this new pro-liberalization class coalition. And some of you could think of this, for example, in terms of the conflicts over urban space, where the new middle class has basically been able to get state support for urban development projects, like particular beautification projects catering to middle class tastes, such as getting rid of squatters in order to build jogging strips in Bombay would be one example, which I've talked about in my fieldwork. So that's the second set of issues which I'd like to talk about. The third set of issues is then I want to talk about how these competing coalitions are producing a lot of tensions and strains on the state, because the state is still multi-class in the sense that it's still a democratic state. And so politicians, governmental elites still have to deal with and sort of negotiate between these competing social groups, even while they may be sort of favoring the middle classes through these new economic policies. So how is the state kind of managing the political strains which are being produced by liberalization? And then finally, in the last part, depending on how time goes, if I have time, I'll just talk a little bit or sort of raise questions about what the possibilities and obstacles are to sort of building cross-class alliances, which could produce maybe more inclusive or sustainable forms of development. So are there other ways in which you can think of cross-class alliances which don't simply reproduce the sort of inequalities and sort of conflicts which are sort of implicit in the sort of neoliberal model which is associated with liberalization? So those are kind of the different sets of issues which I'm going to try and lay out in the presentation. So let me start with the state's ideological practices. What I want to argue in this part is that economic liberalization in India currently operates through two disparate but simultaneous languages of economic development and economic growth. So on the one hand, the state, NGO, and World Bank-sponsored projects produce narratives of sustainable development that mainly target subaltern social groups, particularly in rural areas. On the other hand, state-led and global policies of economic liberalization, they tend to deploy aspirational languages of middle-class consumption, sort of as a sign of the success of such policies. So, for example, the idea that when you look at sort of the 300 or 350 million middle class sort of booming in India, that's kind of a sign of the success of economic policies. So another example would be the way in which public rhetoric on the size of India's middle classes is largely centered on the potential consumer market that this group represents for both Indian and multinational businesses. And this construction of the middle class has also been consolidated by the self-identification of large sections of the middle classes with these new patterns of consumption. So the result of these processes is the tendency to locate consumption as a site of individual privatized strategies that are expanding with liberalization. So what I would like to do in my talk and my presentation is foreground instead the way in which India's new middle class is in fact part of a state-led development regime that, in a sense, underpins current urban development strategies in cities and towns. So part of what I'm trying to say is that there's a tendency to assume that when we think of the state, that the state is focused on sort of development for the poor, and that the middle classes are the site of sort of private, individual practices of consumption. And I want to flip that around a little bit and suggest that, in fact, the middle classes themselves are a central object of development under this sort of new paradigm of economic liberalization. So to actually think about the middle classes as a state project under liberalization. And this is kind of the part where I'm sort of thinking through what I think I learned from my own book, which is that we need to really think about the middle classes in terms of state practices, in terms of the state sort of producing the middle classes and sort of investing resources in the middle classes as an object of development. So in attempting to unpack some of the ideologies which go with this construction of the middle class, I suggest by thinking that by sort of thinking about the middle class as an object of state development, rather than sort of accepting the state's ideologies, there are a number of issues at stake. So what's at stake, for example, is the naturalized association between the state development and socio-economically marginalized groups, which we sometimes assume and which is actually produced by the state. So the state tends to when the state talks about the poor, the urban poor, the rural poor, it tends to talk about the poor as an object of development. And so we tend to, in a sense, naturalize that assumption that development and the state are associated with the urban poor. So to put that another way, I guess what I'm asking us to think about is what could we gain by moving away from the assumption that the poor, the urban and rural poor, are the primary object of state development policies, and ask instead, or assume instead, that it's the middle classes that are now the primary object of state development policy. So how would that kind of shift our framework if we sort of switch the question and interrogate some of these state ideologies which assume that it's the middle class is private and the poor are basically objects of development. So in asking these questions, I'm interested in analyzing the underlying ideological strategies that produce dichotomies between cities and villages and between middle class and subaltern socioeconomic interests. So my analysis first seeks to think about the new middle class in India as part of a state-led project and problem of development, rather than as an expanding consumer group that has naturally been produced by economic growth, to actually think of it as being created by specific state policies and state practices. So let me just begin by focusing on specific languages of development that have been produced in the context of liberalization since the 1990s. So I've noted, for example, that public discourses tend to depict this emerging and expanding new middle class identity as a natural outgrowth of liberalization. So by arguing for an approach that addresses the relationship between this new middle class and the question of development, my objective is to illustrate that this new middle class is in fact partly produced by specific state development policies. So elected officials and politicians have actively participated, for example, in the inflated public rhetoric on the size of India's middle class and on the vast potential consumer market of this group. So prime ministers, for example, from across the ideological range have specifically deployed a narrative about India's expanding middle class as a central platform in governmental efforts to market India's reforms and to draw in private capital. So this has included prime ministers from across the ideological range, ranging from Rajiv Gandhi in the earlier phase of liberalization in the 80s to the BJP, for example, Prime Minister Vajpayee, and of course to more recent rhetoric from Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. So just to give you one example, just maybe to make this easier to follow, just consider a speech by Prime Minister Singh delivered in Saudi Arabia designed to attract foreign capital. And I'll just quote, "Today, India's economy is on the move. For 3 years, we have witnessed growth rates of between 7% and 8.5%. A growing market with a large middle class, abundant raw materials, highly trained and skilled manpower, especially in the field of science technology, is thirsting for new investment." So again, you can see that sort of marketing of the new middle class. Now, this is a very conventional depiction, and it's very familiar because you hear it in the US as well. It's a depiction of the economy linking growth and the middle classes. And this link between growth and the middle classes, I argue, represents a key set of discursive strategies that the state uses in promoting its policies of economic reforms. So, for example, Rob Jenkins has written persuasively about the ways in which Indian politicians and elites were able to push through the first generation of reforms in the 1990s using a range of informal strategies and institutions, particularly at the local and state level. Now, while Jenkins focuses on the hidden nature of this process, what he calls reforms by stealth, the new middle class has in fact operated as the public discursive face of state strategies of reform. So the expansion of middle-class consumption, for example, is a cornerstone of the discursive practices that have characterized state policies of liberalization that have been initiated since the 1990s. Now, this narrative of the rise of the new middle class and the expansion of middle-class consumption coexists with the language of development and sustainable development that is conventionally deployed in policy responses to rural poverty and marginalized socioeconomic groups. So you see this, for example, and this is a very typical example, you see this in development projects that have been initiated in partnership with the government, NGOs, and international organizations like the World Bank. You also see this through the incipient privatization, where the scarcity of the state is filled by NGO-led development. So these state failures lead state governments, in a sense, to turn to privatization. Another example would be, for example, in healthcare and the provision of services to poorer communities. So there's kind of a paradox here in terms of how the multi-class state is viewed in the post-liberalization period. So the prevalent ideological assumption is that the middle classes occupy the new privatized realm of the market, while subaltern social groups are the objects of state-led development, when in fact there are empirical trends in the opposite direction, where state-led development strategies to the poor are being privatized, while the middle class exists as the new object of state-led development. So there's kind of a switch going on, which is underneath the sort of discursive strategies, which tend to naturalize how the state is acting and who the state is focused on, is kind of what I'm trying to suggest there. So in a sense, public common sense discourses invent two separate economies and portray the middle classes and subaltern social groups almost as if they're kind of discrete objects within each of these realms in contemporary India. So it's assumed that the middle classes are inhabiting an economy which is defined by the retreat of the state and are basically associated with growth fueled by the expansion of consumption. And it's assumed that subaltern social groups, such as the rural poor, are located within state economic development, which is then also marked by the need for sustainability and limits on consumption. So there's an assumption, for example, if you look at a lot of the sustainable development projects, they tend to focus on the poor, particularly in terms of village development, while at the same time the state is basically promoting consumption. So again, there's a kind of paradox where on the one hand you're arguing for sustainability through development in sort of the rural villages, while at the same time the state is saying, well, you know, the middle classes need to consume more. So that's the kind of, again, another sort of paradox which emerges from the ways in which sort of the middle classes and the poor are sort of almost assumed to be treated differently by the state, which I'm trying to get at. So what I'm thinking through is the kind of the effects of these kinds of narratives which I'm talking about. So on the one hand, this kind of like opposition between the middle classes and poorer groups obscures the role of the state in shaping current policies of liberalization. So we assume that the state is not as active, for example. In other words, the presentation of the new middle class as the agent of and beneficiary of liberalization allows the state to continue with its practices of reforms by stealth. Now, since such discourses dissociate the middle classes from state-led development, shifts of state resources and development priorities and policies from the urban and rural ports of the middle classes also occur by stealth, right? So in a sense, we don't see that there may be sort of a transfer of resources going from poor communities to the middle classes, while we have this kind of image that it's the poor communities who are the objects of state development. And so that's something which I'm trying to think through, and we'll probably look at some more empirical data to flesh that out. So these are specific examples which I've been giving you to point to some of the bigger sort of patterns of official discourses. Now, my point is not, of course, that there are no counter discourses or tensions within these narratives. I'll just give you one example of the state's recognition of the strains on the multi-class nature of the state, which I talked about earlier. And I'll quote again from a speech from Manmohan Singh. He presented a 10-point social charter for what he called inclusive growth to the Confederation of Indian Industry. Singh specifically addressed the question of growth and consumption, and he noted that, quote, "The time has come for better off sections of our society, not just in organized industry, but in all walks of life, to understand the need to make our growth process more inclusive, to eschew conspicuous consumption, to save more and waste less, to care for those who are less privileged and less well off, to be role models of probity, moderation, and charity." Now, the speech went on to describe the social unrest that would potentially arise from rising inequalities. And he said that, quote, "The electronic media carries the lifestyles of the rich and famous into every village and every slum. Media often highlights the vulgar display of their wealth. An area of great concern is the level of ostentatious expenditure on weddings and other family events. Such vulgarity insults the poverty of the less privileged. It is socially wasteful, and it plants seeds of resentment in the minds of the have-nots." Now, his rhetoric clearly points to a recognition of the intensifying socioeconomic inequalities and the role of consumption practices in making such inequalities visible. So on this front, it does represent a departure from other celebrations of middle-class consumption. However, even though he symbolically recognizes inequality, he still tends to produce the sort of dualistic languages that I've outlined, and he continues to portray consumption as an individual choice. So these examples of official rhetoric point to a deeper structural point regarding the role of the state in materially producing the new middle class. a process which contradicts this ideological construction of the middle class as naturally expanding because of market reforms. And I want to talk a little bit about that structural point now, in terms of how the middle class is actually being produced by state policies. So the new middle class, I suggest, and most of us also probably know, is specifically associated with a cultural and political outlook that has embraced liberalization and rejected the state-managed economy associated with the early decades of Indian independence. So, for example, in dominant public discourses, the old middle classes tend to be associated with a strong form of state dependency, while the new middle class is associated with the choices and opportunities of private sector employment. So the Nehruvian state and subsequent regimes in the first decades of India's development played a central role, as we know, in actually creating and shaping the middle class through state subsidies for higher and English language education and through the promotion of public sector employment. So the historical pattern of the state actually engaging in the creation of the middle class is actually a very old pattern, which you can see in the earlier decades of Indian post-colonial history. And so the expanded Indian state itself, for example, was a primary source of employment for middle-class Indians, thus intensifying this middle-class dependency. Now, conventional portrayals depict the new middle class as a social group that has broken from this dependency and is tied to the expansion of private capital and new economy jobs. So there's an assumption that there's a kind of discrete break in the nature of the state-middle class relationship, that it's moved from dependency to this kind of independent agent, which is being fueled by private capital and sort of expanding growth. And so, however, while the relationship between the new middle class and the state has been restructured, what I argue is that what I'm suggesting through the talk is that state-middle class linkages, in fact, remain a cornerstone of the developmental regime in the post-liberalization period. So, in a sense that those earlier state dependencies, which you assume with the Nehruvian regime, have not broken in the sense that the sort of rhetoric assumes, or the sort of the ideological rhetoric assumes in sort of common sense discourses. So in order to untangle this relationship between the state and the new middle class, I think what we need to do first is consider the role of the state in shaping economic reforms in India. So I've noted, for example, that the state in India has played an active role in shaping India's successive waves of economic reforms. Now, this active state promotion of reform has been particularly evident in the local state government level, as state governments, for example, have actively sought foreign investment. And this pro-reforms orientation of the state has also been consolidated as governmental elites have also developed socio-economic interests that are tied to liberalization. So, for example, state elites have stood to financially benefit from processes of privatization and the expansion of state-private capital joint ventures, both through official policies and also often through unofficial practices of corruption. So, for instance, political science research on the first phase of reforms in the 1990s has shown that Indian politicians soon recognized that liberalization did not necessarily need to spell the end of their influence over key decisions, and that they could continue to play a key role, for example, at the local level, and sort of pursue reforms independent of the central government. So this confluence of interests has continued in subsequent generations of reforms and has led to a broader restructuring of business-state relations. However, despite the restructuring, I argue that the state has continued to play a significant role in shaping and overseeing India's economic trajectory. Now, in the context of this new developmental regime associated with liberalization, what I suggest is that the state has remained a central agent in shaping the material dimensions of new middle-class formation. Consider, for instance, the realm of consumption. As I've noted earlier, consumption patterns are associated with the politics of lifestyle that is the most visible marker of India's new middle class. This emerging politics of lifestyle, however, is not simply a private social-cultural phenomenon or just a set of choices of middle-class individuals simply as a function of changing consumer preferences. But it's also, I would suggest, this lifestyle is also a central component of state-led liberalization. So, for example, the political economy of lifestyle is specifically structured by local state strategies of urban redevelopment that promote new middle-class-oriented models of urban life. So some of the ethnographic research, again here, which I'm implicitly drawing on from my earlier work, has shown that, for example, in a range of cities and urban areas, these strategies center on the question of land usage and also highly lucrative financial deals that benefit both local state officials and private developers. So when I'm talking about, for example, taking back urban space from street vendors, for example, the state is also benefiting financially through those kinds of transactions. Now, it's not just limited to urban areas, and so I also see a lot of continuities with some of the rural strategies of development. And some of the recent examples, which have been in the news and have been talked about, would be, for example, policies regarding special economic zones. And you can think of, for example, the Tata production of the nano car and the controversy in West Bengal when the state sort of forcibly tried to evict the villagers from their land in order to sort of let Tata sort of base their production in West Bengal, and then sort of the violence and controversy, and in that case, it's sort of successful resistance. So these kinds of ways in which the state is sort of reshaping development through managing land in new ways is both an urban and rural phenomena. Now, the way in which I'm thinking about this is that these practices further illustrate the role of the state in facilitating privatization through both official, informal, and sometimes illegal practices. And you can see that in the SEE zone example. You can also see this, for example, another example would be the sale of textile mills in Bombay or Mumbai, where, for example, despite legal restrictions on the sale of textile mills, most of the mills were actually sold without actual legal authority, and sort of turned over in partnership with private capital for new developments, and sort of more new middle class oriented infrastructure. Now, these strategies are not simply examples of state responses to middle class consumer based demands. Rather, they represent a set of practices and policies that engage in the material production of new middle class lifestyle. So my point here is simply that they point to important historical continuities between the state-managed middle classes of the Nehruvian period and then the new middle class in the post-liberalization period, and caution us from assuming that new middle class politics and identities necessarily represent a sharp break from the past. So again, you see that those continuities of state dependence, where the state is actually investing a lot of energy and resources into the new middle classes, while claiming that the new middle class is simply a creation of natural growth and natural sort of natural sort of expansion of private capital. So just to sum up that section, what I'm trying to say is that the middle classes, in a sense, are benefiting from this kind of state-subsidized model of lifestyle. So just think about lifestyle. Lifestyle is not just simply like the people responding to ads on television. It's actually the way in which the state is sort of materially producing this social group, and the kind of financial interest the state also has in sort of producing the new middle class through these policies. Now, in this analysis, I'm focusing a lot of the middle class seems a little bit passive, so I don't want anyone to assume that the middle class is kind of devoid of agency. So, for example, in my old past research, I've talked about, for example, the range of middle class practices and forms of civic and associational life in which the new middle classes are also making demands on the state. So they're asking the state to take back urban space. They're asking the state to cater to their interests as well. So it's a little bit more dynamic than it may be coming across in this talk. However, the imbricated nature of this relationship between the state and new middle class, I think, holds important implications for any questions of urban livability and anyone interested in more inclusive or equitable forms of development in India. So at one level, this invested nature of the state suggests that any political attempt at linking the question of promoting more inclusive models of urban livability with new middle class practices requires more than shifts in attitudes of the middle class. So it's not simply that the middle class has to be more concerned with the poor, it's more that there's a deeper sort of shift in the state development strategy which needs to be which needs to occur to sort of get us to a more inclusive and equal form of development. So let me just turn to the last part of my talk. I think I'll skip the part on the cross-class alliances, but let me talk a little bit about some of the political strains on the state and some of the internal fractures within the middle class, because the backdrop of all of this is the state is sort of engaging in these sort of development practices oriented to the new middle class, but it's still a multi-class state, right? So it'll come election time, the state is still responsible for getting enough votes to get elected. And a lot of these strains you can see in the Congress party, for those of you who follow Indian politics. You see this in some of the Congress party dilemmas when they're trying to sort of manage the tensions between acting like they're sort of pro-poor and sort of continuing to sort of assure everyone they're going to go ahead with liberalization. So you already see these tensions, but what I want to focus on a little bit is the sort of fractures, not just between the poor and the new middle classes, but also some of the divisions within the middle classes, which tend to put strains on the state as it's trying to sort of manage the sort of multi-class political nature of its policies. So what I'd like to do is actually just focus on the issue of caste inequality, just to give you one example to talk about what I mean by these strains. So caste, as most of you know, has been a central factor that has shaped the developmental agenda of the Indian state. So for example, caste-based reservations have been a central element in the state's developmental strategy. It's geared specifically at incorporating sections of subordinated caste groups within its developmental coalition. So in the post-liberalization period, the politics of expanding demands for caste equality and reservations, again, give us a sense of the difficulty of the state's attempts to keep those two economies which it's trying to construct in separate spaces. So caste represents a very potent inequality that's sort of blurring the lines between the models of middle-class economic growth on the one hand and the sort of models of sort of the subaltern-oriented development on the other. And you can see this very clearly when you look at inequalities within the middle classes. So for example, India's new middle class, as I've been saying, represents a dominant socio-political identity, but this identity is often at odds with the socio-economic realities of large sections of the middle classes. So the political construction of the new middle class as a consumption-driven group that automatically benefits from liberalization, in fact, is contradicted by members of the new middle class who are either tracked into lower-tier segments of the economy, and especially with segments of the middle classes that cannot gain access to these thriving sectors of the economy. So you kind of have this dominant image of this thriving new middle class, but then you have large segments of the middle classes who are actually not getting access to these new economy jobs. So just to give you a little bit of data, so empirical data reveals that it's still largely upper caste, English-speaking elite tiers of the middle classes that make up the top tiers of this new liberalizing middle class. The acquisition of various forms of social capital, such as education, English skills, aesthetic and cultural knowledge, and also inequalities such as caste, religion, and region, produce very rigid forms of distinction between different segments of the middle classes. For example, the Muslim middle classes and newly emerging Dalit middle classes have not really had much access to upper-tier white-collar middle-class employment, and there's some very good sociological work coming out of India which shows the sort of caste barriers to getting access to new economy jobs, for example, in the IT and high-tech industries. So large sections of the middle classes continue to rely on state employment. And again, you see that continuity of the middle class dependency on sort of state employment. So it's not that break, again, as I was saying, has occurred. So old and new regimes of state-led development continue to overlap in ways that provoke tensions between different fractions of the middle classes. And I want to concentrate basically this part of the argument on the social conflicts over demands for caste-based reservations in education and employment to hopefully make this a little clearer. So contemporary politics in India has been characterized by sharp public debates on state reservations. Now, in recent years, this debate has extended to the question of reservations in the private sector. So the rise of this debate about private sector employment, the idea of having quotas, for example, not just in state educational institutions, but also in private sector companies, in a sense, what I think it does is it should have encapsulate these tensions between these two competing state development projects, which I'm trying to flesh out. So at a surface level, for example, what the Congress-led coalition government has been trying to do is it's been opening up the political and policy space for private sector reservations. So it's been trying to sort of, has been suggesting that it's open to private sector reservations. Now that at one level has to do with the basic electoral calculus. That's part of the way in which it's managing the strains of these competing demands which I'm talking about. However, I think at a deeper level, the Congress-led coalition government has also been faced with the problem of managing these strains, which has of the liberalizing economy, which has not provided opportunities for middle-class individuals who are continually exposed to this kind of undelivered promise of access to new middle-class membership. So private sector reservations is kind of like a Congress-led state policy response to these tensions and sort of conflicts, not just between the poor and the middle classes, but in a sense between segments of the middle classes. So segments of the middle classes are not getting access to new economy jobs. So that's one of the ways in which the government is trying to sort of manage those conflicts. So what I suggest is that these conflicts again point to the kind of precariousness of this new coalition, which is shaping state liberalization. Because if you remember, what I started off by saying is I was trying to look at shifting class coalitions and how those are sort of shaping state practices. So the issue of caste gives you one sort of example of that. So in the last part of my presentation, which I think I might skip over so we can have more of a discussion, I was going to. This is where I try and get to a more sort of optimistic part, which is to try and think of possibilities. So are there possibilities of cross-class alliances which don't fit this model of sort of inequality, opposition between the poor and the middle classes, and between the upper segments of the middle classes and the lower middle classes? And the picture is kind of mixed. There's a lot, rich history in India of cross-class alliances. A lot of the NGOs, in the past have, middle-class NGOs have focused on urban and rural poverty. Some of the new research which is being done, people like John Harris, and I know Amita Bhaviskar was here too, have argued that the reverse is happening, that middle-class NGOs and, for example, environmental movements are becoming more exclusionary. So the mixture is a little bit mixed, and the picture is a little bit mixed, and there is still the sort of basic fact that one of the most successful cross-class coalitions or movements has really been the Hindu nationalist movement, because they've really used religion and particular kinds of sort of demonization to sort of bring together different sort of class fractions in a sense. So that's where I am in terms of the cross-class coalition. So where I'm going with this set of reflections, as you can see, I've sort of sketched out a lot of broad issues, and what I'm trying to do next with this is it's turning into a sort of specific project, comparative project with some sociologists who are looking at the sort of effect of the new middle classes on social policy and the welfare state, and they're trying to broaden that to not just look at Western Europe. And so I'm probably going to look at education and health and sort of add more empirical depth and sort of look at how these sort of shifting class coalitions are impacting the way in which the state is sort of assigning resources, what this means for different social groups. So that's kind of where I'm leaning towards in terms of how this will probably get revised at some point. So let me stop there and see what people have to say.